My name's Layla, a 34-year-old who thought she had it all sorted out. I was a part-time accountant, juggling numbers by day and living the simple, happy life I'd always wanted with Mark, my husband. He was a manager at a decent firm, and together, we were the picture of modest contentment. That was until his promotion turned our modest life into something unrecognizable. Initially, Mark's promotion felt like a blessing. "We've hit the jackpot, Layla," he exclaimed the night he got the news. His eyes sparkled with the same warmth I fell in love with. "You won't have to work anymore. How about you take care of our nest while I hustle for the both of us?" It sounded like a dream, but dreams often turn into nightmares. As the money flowed in, Mark's humility flowed out. His once gentle demeanor was replaced by an air of superiority that filled every corner of our home, suffocating me. He started coming home late, reeking of arrogance and expensive cologne. "Layla, this house looks like a dump. Can't you do better?" His words were like daggers, each one striking deep into my heart. "I'm trying, Mark. I'm doing all I can," I'd reply, my voice barely a whisper, trying to hold on to the fragments of the man I married. The house I once took pride in turned into a battlefield, with Mark as the relentless commander. "I didn't marry you to have a partner, Layla. I married you for comfort, for someone to clean up after me," he'd declare, his words slicing through the air like a blade. His cruelty knew no bounds. "You can't even give me a child. What good are you, Layla?" he'd shout, each word a blow to my womanhood. I'd look away, but he'd grab my chin, forcing me to meet his cold gaze. "Look at me when I'm talking to you. Is this what you want? To be a useless wife?" I'd swallow my tears, nodding along to his ruthless words, too broken to speak. The man I vowed to spend my life with had turned into my tormentor, finding joy in my despair. Even the parties, once a source of joy, became a stage for my humiliation. "Layla, make sure everything is perfect tonight. Mrs. Dawson doesn't like mediocrity," Mark would command, reducing me to a mere prop in his show of success. I'd spend hours preparing, trying to meet his impossible standards. But it was never enough. The steak was overcooked, the decor was tacky, and you, Layla, you were the biggest disappointment of the evening, he'd hiss after the guests left, each word a nail in the coffin of my self-esteem. Life with Mark had transformed into an exhausting routine of servitude. I, Layla, once his partner, was now nothing more than a shadow in my own home, a mere housekeeper in his eyes. Every evening was a replay of disdain. Mark would storm in, flinging his coat at me like I was a coat rack. "Here, deal with this mess," he'd bark, as if talking to an underling, not his wife. "I've got the laundry done, Mark. Dinner's almost ready too," I'd say, hoping to ease his mood, my words tiptoeing around his temper. "Dinner? You mean that slop you cook?" "Don't make me laugh, Layla," he'd scoff, his laughter void of any joy, just a sharp jab at my efforts. It wasn't just his words. It was his actions too. He'd leave a trail of his belongings around the house, a silent order for me to clean up after him. And if the food wasn't to his exact liking, into the bin it went, my hours in the kitchen dismissed, with a flick of his hand. "Too salty, Layla. Are you trying to poison me?" he'd spit out, his words like venom. I followed the recipe, Mark. "I thought it was how you liked it," I'd mumble, my spirit withering under his constant critique. He didn't stop there. Mark knew I had nowhere else to go, no financial backup to fall back on. He made sure I remembered that every single day. "Where'd you spend the money this time, Layla?" "On more useless stuff," he'd sneer, poring over the expense receipts like a detective. "Groceries, Mark. And some cleaning supplies," I'd reply, handing over the receipts, a proof of my innocence in his court of judgment. He'd scan every item, his eyes hunting for a mistake, a misstep. "Cleaning supplies? What for?" "The house is still a mess," he'd say, his words slicing through the silence, cutting deeper than the sharpest knife. I was trapped in a cycle of endless scrutiny. Every penny I spent was a penny he earned, and he never let me forget that. I was accountable for every breath I took, every move I made, in the suffocating space that was once our shared home. Layla, you know the drill. Impress Mrs. Dawson, impress them all. Don't screw this up, Mark would remind me, his words a constant echo in the back of my mind. The kitchen became my battlefield, every dish a mission. I'd chop, stir, and season, hoping each flavor was just right. This sauce better be perfect, Layla. Don't make me regret letting you handle it, Mark would say, peering over my shoulder, his presence heavy, suffocating. I've got it, Mark. It'll be great, I'd assure him, my hands shaking, the pressure building like a storm. The hours before the guests arrived were a frantic rush. The clinking of dishes, the simmering of pots, the subtle alignment of cutlery. Every detail had to be flawless, not for pride, but for fear of Mark's wrath. As the guests started to arrive, the air would shift. Mark, the tyrant at home, transformed into Mark, the gracious host. Ah, Mrs. Dawson, what an honor to have you. Layla has outdone herself tonight, he'd boast, his arm around me, a hollow gesture, for the audience. The night would progress, a charade of laughter and clinking glasses. Mark's colleagues, oblivious to the reality, would praise the ambience, the food, the impeccable hostess. Layla, you've outdone yourself. This is exquisite, they'd compliment, their words a bitter reminder of my invisible chains. Oh, it's nothing. Just something I whipped up, I'd reply, my smile hiding the turmoil within, my hands aching from the effort to keep the facade alive. But the real performance began when the guests left. Mark's mask would fall off, his true colors, dark and cruel, splashing over the remains of the night. The steak was overdone, Layla. The decor, tasteless. And you were the biggest disappointment, he'd spit out, his words laced with venom, each syllable a strike to my already battered self. But the night wasn't over until Mark had his say, away from the prying eyes of the world. The salad was wilted, Layla. And those curtains? A tacky choice. You always find a way to embarrass me, he'd hiss, his words a torrent, washing away any sense of accomplishment I might have felt. I tried, Mark. I really did. Mrs. Dawson seemed to enjoy it. I'd defend weakly, my defense crumbling under his intense glare. Seemed? I don't pay you for seemed, Layla. I need perfection. You can't even get a simple party right, he'd retort, his voice cold, devoid of any understanding or love. The aftermath of the parties was always the same. The silence of the house echoed my loneliness, the leftover dishes a metaphor for my life with Mark, a mess, waiting to be cleaned up, waiting for a new day to start the charade all over again. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, each one bringing a heavier silence and a colder distance between Mark and me. It wasn't just the contempt or the harsh words anymore, it was something else, something more sinister, lurking in the shadows of our hollow home. Mark's late nights became more frequent, each return home later than the last, each excuse more flimsy than the one before. Work, Layla. It's all work. You wouldn't understand, he'd say, his words slurred, the stench of alcohol mixed with something sweeter, something unfamiliar, clinging to his clothes. I tried to ignore it, to bury my suspicions under the mountain of my daily chores. But the whispers in my mind grew louder, impossible to silence. Mark, you're home late again. Is everything okay at work? I'd ask, my voice shaky, tiptoeing around the truth I was too afraid to face. Everything's fine, Layla. Better than fine. Stop nagging, would you? He'd snap, his eyes avoiding mine, his body language screaming the lies his mouth wouldn't admit. The signs were there, bold and glaring. The late-night calls he'd quickly silence, the sudden spurts of cologne before he'd leave the house, the way his eyes stopped meeting mine. Who was on the phone, Mark? It sounded important. I'd inquire, my heart pounding against my chest, bracing for his reaction. Business, Layla. Just business. Why can't you just mind your own? He'd retort, his impatience a thick veil, covering the truth. It wasn't just his words or his actions, it was the gut-wrenching feeling that crept up on me in the dead of night, the realization that the man I shared my bed with was a stranger, his thoughts, his desires, existing in a world I was no longer a part of. Mark's late returns had become the norm, each night a repeat of the last. His excuses were thin, his demeanor colder, each step echoing in the hollow space between us. The smell of alcohol had become a part of him, a constant reminder of the distance growing between us. "Mark, it's late. You smell of liquor again. Where were you?" I'd ask, my voice low, barely hiding the tremble of my fears. "It's none of your business, Layla. Just mind your chores and stop prying," he'd snap back, his words sharp, cutting through the tense air. The nights dragged on, each one longer than the last. Mark's presence in the house felt like a storm, unsettling and unpredictable. One night, it all came to a head. He stumbled through the door, more inebriated than usual, a cloud of unfamiliar perfume trailing behind him. "Here, deal with this," he slurred, tossing his coat at me like I was nothing more than a coat rack. "Clean it. I need it for tomorrow," he commanded before staggering off to bed, leaving me standing there, coat in hand, heart in pieces. As I started to shake out the coat, something unexpected fell to the floor. It was a document, official and ominous. I picked it up, my hands trembling, my mind racing. It was a divorce application, completed and signed. Mark's signature, a mark of the end, lay there, stark and final. I stood there, stunned, the paper heavy in my hands. Then, something unexpected happened. A laugh escaped my lips, not a laugh of joy, but one of realization. This was it, the last straw, the final insult to the injury that had been my life with Mark. But I said nothing to him. No, this wasn't a moment for words. This was a moment for action, for decisions, for change. I took a deep breath, the weight of the years bearing down on me, the weight of the decision lifting me. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't question. I didn't doubt. I made a choice to act, to move forward, to reclaim the life that had been mine before it became ours. Mark had made his move, and now it was my turn. The path wouldn't be easy, but the hardest decisions rarely are. That morning, the sun seemed to shine a bit differently, casting a new light on the familiar walls of the home I shared with Mark. I handed him his coat, freshly cleaned, a routine task that felt strangely final. He barely acknowledged it, his mind already on the day ahead. "Layla, what's for breakfast?" "Make it quick, I'm in a hurry," Mark said, his voice sharp, slicing through the quiet morning. I replied with a calm I hadn't felt in years. "It's almost ready, Mark. Your usual." He grunted in response, his attention fixed on his phone. As he ate, I noticed how the distance between us had grown, a chasm that no words or actions could bridge anymore. When he finished, he pushed the plate away and stood up, ready to leave for work. "Remember, Layla, we have guests tonight. Make sure everything is perfect, especially for Mrs. Dawson. And this place," he gestured around, "better be spotless." His words, once the dictators of my actions, now felt hollow, empty of the power they once held over me. "Of course, Mark. Everything will be ready," I said, the edges of my lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. After he left, the silence of the house enveloped me. It wasn't suffocating anymore, it was liberating. I looked at the divorce papers I had signed and filed at court. Each word on those pages was a step towards reclaiming my life, a life I had almost forgotten in the shadows of Mark's imposing presence. The next few days were a blur of newfound purpose. I updated my resume, scoured job listings, and even attended a couple of interviews. The world outside, which I had viewed through the tinted glasses of my married life, now opened up with colors of hope and possibilities. Then, one morning, as if on cue with the life I was slowly leaving behind, Mark announced another one of his parties. "Layla, we're having guests tonight. My team and Mrs. Dawson. I don't need to remind you how important this is. Get the house ready, and the dinner better be impressive." His words fell on deaf ears. The Layla he was addressing no longer existed. I wasn't the trembling, eager to please wife anymore. I was a woman on the brink of a new beginning, standing on the ashes of a life I was ready to leave behind. He left for work, and the house felt different. It felt like my space, not the battleground it used to be. I made myself a simple lunch, savoring each bite, each moment of quiet, knowing that the evening would bring the final act of the farce my marriage had become. As I sat there, eating, the realization of my newfound freedom filled me with a sense of peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't worried about the evening, about the guests, about Mark's impossible standards. I had stepped out of the role he had cast me in, shedding the character of the docile, subservient wife. The hours ticked by, and the time for the party approached. But the flurry of activity, the rush to impress, was absent. Instead, I sat there, a quiet observer of the life I was leaving behind. Mark would be home soon, expecting a house buzzing with preparations, the air filled with the aroma of a lavish dinner. But what he would come home to was the stark reality of a marriage that had crumbled, a partnership that was no more. I wasn't afraid. The fear that had once consumed me, that had dictated my every move, had dissipated, replaced by a resolve as strong as the morning sun that had ushered in this day of change. Evening had settled in when Mark barged through the door, the cold air sneaking in behind him as he forgot to close it. His eyes scanned the quiet house, expecting the usual hustle of party preparations. But there was nothing. Just silence, just me, standing calmly amidst the stillness. "What is this, Layla? Where's the dinner? The guests, they could be here any minute," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the empty space. I met his gaze, my voice calm, but firm. "There's no dinner, Mark. No party. We're divorced. I don't owe you anything anymore," I declared, the truth hanging heavy between us. His face went from anger to shock, his mouth opening and closing, struggling to grasp the reality I laid before him. "Divorced? What nonsense is this, Layla? You're talking crazy," he stammered, his composure slipping. "Not nonsense, Mark. Fact. Remember the divorce papers you had in your coat? I found them, signed them, and filed them. It's done," I said, each word deliberate, each syllable sealing the end of our farce. His shock turned to rage, his words a desperate attempt to regain control. "You fool. That was just to show my boss, Mrs. Dawson, to get her off my back. She's my lover. Do you think I got a promotion at work? I would never actually divorce you. She's old, Layla, way older and scarier than you. It was all for the promotion, don't you see?" He spat out, his words twisted, trying to weave a new web of lies. I listened, the absurdity of his excuses almost laughable. So, it was all a game? The boss, the divorce, all for a promotion? So you smelled like Mrs. Dawson's perfume? Or do you have another woman? I asked, my voice steady, my resolve unshaken. He laughed until he cried. "You're right, silly. I have a stunning mistress, young and beautiful. You and Mrs. Dawson are no match for her, I'm just playing with you." But his smirk faded, his words trailing off into silence as a cough echoed through the room. We both turned towards the sound, the forgotten open door, framing the figure standing there. His boss, her expression cold and piercing, her eyes locked on Mark. His colleagues, a mix of confusion and disbelief on their faces. The room was still, the tension palpable. Mark's boss, her face a mask of fury, stood over him. "Mark, explain yourself. Was this all just a game for you? Using me to climb the career ladder?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Mark, the color drained from his face, dropped to his knees. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by desperation. No, you've got it all wrong. It's not like that at all. I respect you immensely. Please, you have to believe me," he pleaded, his hands clasped together, his eyes begging for a shred of mercy. But there was no mercy in his boss's eyes, only contempt. "Respect? You dare talk about respect after what I just heard? You're a disgrace, Mark. Not only have you made a mockery of our personal relationship, but you've also shown your true colors as a man," she spat, her words laced with disgust. I'm sorry, truly sorry. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. Please, give me another chance, Mark begged, his voice barely above a whisper, his figure small and defeated on the floor. The boss shook her head, her decision as firm as her stance. A mistake? No, Mark. This was a calculated move on your part, and it's going to cost you. As of tomorrow, you are no longer employed at my company. And trust me, I'll make sure your reputation follows you wherever you go. No decent company will touch you after this, she declared, her verdict final. With that, she turned on her heel and left, her presence leaving a void that was quickly filled by a heavy, suffocating silence. One by one, Mark's colleagues followed, their quick glances of pity and disdain a clear sign of the social and professional ostracism that awaited him. And there he was, Mark, still on his knees, the mighty man reduced to a crumpled figure of defeat. I couldn't help but let out a laugh, not of joy, but of disbelief at the irony of it all. I began to gather my things, each item a token of the life I was leaving behind. Mark's eyes followed me, a mix of confusion and desperation in his gaze. Layla, please, don't leave me like this. I have nothing left. I need you, he begged, his voice a hollow echo of his former self. I stopped, my bag in hand, and turned to face him. Need me? Like you needed your boss, or your mistress, or your precious career? No, Mark. You've made your bed, and now you get to lie in it. Alone, I said, my words clear, my resolve unwavering. But Layla, I made a mistake. I can change. Please, he continued, his pleas a stark contrast to the man who once held the power in our home. I shook my head, a wry smile on my lips. Change? You don't need change, Mark. You need a miracle. And as for staying, you seem to have plenty of company without me. I'm sure you'll manage, I replied, my tone final, my decision made. Life had taken a turn for both of us, but in different directions. I found myself in a cozy apartment, small, but mine. I got a job, nothing fancy, but it was a start, a step away from the shadows of my past with Mark. Mark was in a tough spot. His boss had done a number on him. Everywhere he tried, doors slammed shut. His big-time career was now just a pile of dust. He was left picking up odd jobs here and there, nothing official, just enough to scrape by. His once lavish house was now just a big, empty space, no laughter, no life, just him and his regrets. I heard whispers about his young mistress. She was out as soon as the cash stopped flowing. Can't say I was surprised. Now, Mark was all alone in that big house, no one to clean up after him, no one to listen to his woes. But life was different for me. I rekindled old friendships, caught up with girlfriends I hadn't seen in ages. There were laughs, shared memories, and support, something I hadn't felt in a long while. One day, over coffee, a friend noticed the change in me. You're different, stronger, she said, a smile lighting up her face. I smiled back, feeling the truth in her words. Yeah, it's been tough, but I'm getting there. Thinking about getting some help, too. Talking to a psychologist, you know? She nodded, understanding in her eyes. That's great, really great. You're taking control, moving on. Mark's loss, totally. I chuckled, the sound light and free. Yeah, Mark's on his own path now. Heard he's barely getting by. His mistress left him, too. Her eyes widened. Seriously? Wow, that's rough. But you're doing good, right? Reconnecting with folks, thinking about therapy? I nodded, a sense of pride swelling in my chest. Yeah, it feels right. It's about time I took care of myself, you know? Life had changed, and so had I. The apartment slowly filled with traces of a new beginning. The job, the friends, the future therapy sessions, they were all pieces of a new life I was building, brick by brick. Each night, as I turned off the lights, I felt a sense of peace. I had faced the storm, emerged stronger, and was now ready for whatever lay ahead. A new day, a new challenge, a new horizon. Not as Mark's shadow, but as my own person, unafraid and undeterred, ready to write my own story.